Okay, welcome everybody to class number 2. Today we're going to focus on Congress and the powers of Congress in the Constitution, and the limits the Constitution puts on Congress. Next week we're going to talk about the president, presidential power, the immunity case, and a lot of different cases dealing with the powers of the president and limits on the president. And so those will be the first 3 classes. And the logic of that is that the first 3 classes are the structural part of the Constitution. You can really think of the Constitution as having a structural part. It creates our government. And then the other really important part of the Constitution is the second half of this course, which is our individual rights. And we're going to look at equal protection. We're going to look at due process and abortion issues, and we're going to look at the First Amendment. So those are our individual rights. There are a lot more, but those are the big ones that we're going to cover. So the first 3 classes, structure, last 3 classes, individual rights. Today, Congress, what does the Constitution say about Congress? How does it limit Congress? And also the states. What power does the Constitution give to this? What powers does the Constitution give to the states? We're going to look at several famous cases throughout these 6 classes. We're hoping to read upwards of 25 or 30 of the most important, most famous Supreme Court cases. So we're going to look at 3 or 4 of those today, and 3 or 4 more each of the rest of the classes. Before we turn to today's topic, a couple of preliminaries. First, I always like to look at the news. And as I tell my students, and by the way, I teach in the Georgetown, I teach law students. I'm in the LLM program at Georgetown, which means they're all foreign students who already have a law degree, and they come here to get an advanced law degree from Georgetown. So it's a great body of students that I teach. But they love to learn about the Constitution. They love to learn about America. And as I always tell them, the more you know about the Constitution, the more you know about our country. And one of the things I love to show them is I open up every class by looking at the news from today. And I looked at WTOP radio today, and I looked at Washington Post and New York Times. WTOP had a story on a judge ordering University of Maryland to allow Palestinian students to hold a vigil, holding that the university, by denying that, they had denied their First Amendment rights. Second story in the Post, there's a bill in the Senate right now to try to cap the gifts that people can give Supreme Court justices to $50. And the third that happened literally just a few hours ago, this is about as fresh as you can get, but just a few hours ago, the Supreme Court denied cert, or denied taking a case had been brought by some conservative states challenging environmental regulations that President Biden had put forth that had limited the emissions of mercury, methane, and other gases from industrial facilities. Interestingly, in that case, so the decision came down just a few hours ago, literally, and then the Oklahoma Attorney General, one of the guys leading the challenge who wanted to knock out these laws, said that he was disappointed, that he and the other challengers were disappointed, but that, quote, they would stand by and respect the court's decision. So that, to me, is what rule of law is all about, and that's what we need. Again, I mentioned these at the start of each class because many news stories don't actually have the word Constitution in it, but if you know enough about the Constitution, you see that many news stories actually involve the Constitution. Okay, so one thing I'd like to do is just recap the last class for any of you who are not here. Very quickly, what were the key takeaways from the last class? Number 1, we start with the story of about 50 miles north of here, on November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln finished his address honoring those who had died at Gettysburg with these words: that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So that was a big point of last week's class, right? That this Constitution is the people's Constitution. In a literal sense, right? The people's representatives wrote the Constitution, the people ratified the Constitution, The Constitution and the government that it creates, our government, is strictly for the benefit of the people, not for the benefit of those in government. And last, neither the President nor Congress nor the Supreme Court can change or amend the Constitution. Only the people can actually change or amend the Constitution. So the document we're studying, the Constitution, is truly belongs to we the people. Second takeaway from last class, these two little balances of power. I have them up here in this chart. You have this vertical balance between the state and the federal government, and then you have a horizontal balance, legislative, executive, judicial. And both of those balances, they come up time and again. All 6 classes in this course will talk about those balances. They've frankly come up in about half of the Supreme Court cases. One way or another, they're focused on the vertical balance of power, the federal, which is also called the Federalism balance of power, and then the horizontal balance of power. Third and last, we looked at one of the 3 branches of government last class, the judiciary. We looked at the judiciary through the case of Marbury v. Madison, one of the most famous cases ever. And we read Chief Justice Marshall's famous line where he said that it is, quote, the province and the duty of the courts to declare what the law is. That declaration has been followed for over 200 years and has not really been questioned and has helped to establish rule of law in America. Okay, turning to today's topic, the Congress. Of the 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, which branch did the founders think was the most dangerous? Which of the 3 branches did the founders think was the most dangerous? Anybody have a guess? Incorrect. It was the legislative. It was the topic for today. James, I will quote Federalist Paper number 47. James Madison wrote, quote, the legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. It is against the enterprising ambition of this department that the people ought to indulge all their jealousy and exhaust all their precautions. So they were very much focused on the legislature as the most dangerous branch. Why? Because the legislature alone has the power to make law. Right? The government is mainly a government about making laws, and only the legislature can make law. So what did the founders do? They had this kind of dangerous branch. What did they do with it? Well, they gave it a lot of power, for sure, but then they put in place lots of checks and balances. And just to name a few of those checks and balances, I'm sure many of you know a lot of these by heart. Bicameralism, right? And to become a law, you cannot become a law unless you have a majority in both House and the Senate. It's called bicameralism. Presentment, the law must be presented to the president and signed. And then, of course, the presidential veto is a further check on Congress. The sheer size of each chamber, we see that today. 100 in the Senate currently and 435 in the House. It's very hard to get agreement on laws. We see that today. Sometimes the Congress is paralyzed. Often they're paralyzed. Another check that Congress has imposed on itself, but it's not in the Constitution, is the filibuster. The filibuster certainly serves as a major check in the Senate, but it's not constitutionally required. All the others I mentioned are constitutionally required. 2 more checks: judicial review, a huge check on Congress is judicial review, and of course the Bill of Rights. But I omitted one check and balance from my list. I went through about 7 or 8 checks and balances on Congress, but I omitted one. I'm going to come to that next. I want to ask the class, does anybody know, what did I omit? What did I omit? What did I fail to mention that serves as a check or balance on Congress? The voters, that's not what I had in mind, but that's an excellent point, because as we know, so that's absolutely a check and balance. Next week we're going to talk about how voters serve as a check on the president, and representatives have to run every 2 years, and oftentimes they lose. Voters don't like them, so that's an excellent answer. Voters are absolutely a check and balance. But what is the kind of the most fundamental check on Congress? No, the most fundamental check is that Congress is a body of enumerated powers only, And the court takes that very, very seriously, as we're going to see. We're going to read some of the famous cases where Congress deals with this. So Congress, it has the powers given to it in the Constitution, but no other powers. It's a list of enumerated powers. We're going to look at that list. It's in the Constitution. And so every time Congress acts, and we have clients who come to my law firm and say, we don't like that law, we want to challenge it. It's okay, let's see if we can say that it's beyond the power of Congress to pass this law. So that is the most fundamental check. And if there's one thing you can take away from today's class that is so important, I tell this to my law students, is this point, that Congress is very powerful, but they are a body of enumerated powers only, just like the President. The President is also a president of enumerated powers. In contrast, the states are the exact opposite. The states have unlimited power to pass any law that they think is for the general welfare of the people. Now, of course, those laws of the state, they have to comply with the Constitution. They can't be discriminatory. They have all kinds of restrictions. But as long as a state law, the state has no obligation to say, what is the source of your law? Point me to the source of your law. Most states can simply say, this is laws for the betterment of the people. Congress cannot say, oh, this law will just help Americans. That's not good enough, and we're going to see examples of that today. So this kind of polar opposite structure of the state governments and the federal governments is a key takeaway today. So now let's take dive, literally, quite literally, lays out the powers of Congress. So Congress has the power on Article 1, Section 8, to lay and collect taxes. We don't like that power very much, but they have the power to lay and collect taxes, to borrow money, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states. That power to regulate commerce is probably their single biggest power, the power to regulate commerce. The power to make rules for naturalization, which has been interpreted by the court to give huge power to Congress to control immigration. Congress regulates immigration, not the president in this country. That's how the court has interpreted that clause and a few other clauses. So when former President Trump or Vice President Harris says they're going to do something on the border, shut the border, or do something on the border, the next question is, okay, under what authority do you do that? And they have to point to a law passed by Congress in order to do that. Okay, other powers of Congress. Here's a really big one. Again, we're in Article 1, Section 8. The power to declare war. So next week, we're going to talk about the president's powers, and in talking about the president, we're going to also talk about war power. War power is one of those powers that is classically shared. The Constitution very intentionally split the war power. It gave to Congress the power to declare war, but not only that, I'll just read from the Constitution, to raise and support armies. Now, these are powers of Congress: to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining a militia. So these are all powers of Congress. Of course, the president shares in those powers because the Constitution makes him commander-in-chief. And so they very intentionally share the war power. We're going to look at that more next week. And then the last power given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 is very interesting. It says at the very end of Section 8, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it means that you not only do you have the power to coin money or to create a post office, but so to create one of the powers, I didn't read it, but one of the powers in Section 8 is to create a post office. So what ancillary powers are needed? Maybe you've got to hire some postmen, right, if you're going to have a post office. So any of the powers that are ancillary to the listed power are captured by the Necessary and Proper Clause. And so again, why did the founders go to all this trouble? Why did they list all these powers and say, okay, we're going to give you these powers, but not anymore? Because they were deathly worried about dictatorship, deathly worried that this country would turn into a tyranny, and that the Congress would start passing laws saying, oh, sorry, you don't have freedom of speech anymore. Sorry, you don't have the right to travel anymore. You don't have the right to vote anymore. So they were fundamentally worried about that for very good reason. All you need to do is look around the world today and you can see the problems that exist. So they worked very hard to, on the one hand, give these powers to Congress, on the other hand, check and balance Congress so that they weren't too powerful. That I like to think of it very much as Goldilocks, right? Goldilocks came to the cabin in the woods, and the first porridge was too cold, no good. Next one was too hot, and then the last one was just right. And that's exactly what the founders were doing, right? They didn't want to give too little power to Congress, because that was, we saw in the Articles of Confederation, the failure of the Articles of Confederation, because they gave Congress too little power. But they didn't want to give them too much either. That was one of the lessons of the Revolution, that a distant power with too much, a distant centralized power would usurp our freedoms. So that was this was this Goldilocks effort by the Founding Fathers. How do we create a Congress that's powerful enough, but not too powerful? So, to remove any doubt that these powers were, that the Congress had these enumerated powers, but no other powers, they added the 10th Amendment. So the 10th Amendment, very short, the powers not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So the 10th Amendment and this idea of enumerated powers in the 10th Amendment, they work together hand in glove. And so every time Congress acts, every single thing they do, a fair question is, okay, what is your authority for taking that action? And as we'll see, the Supreme Court has been left with the task of kind of figuring out, is this law that Congress passed part of the powers given to it by the Constitution? And we saw in Marbury v. Madison, right off the bat, in 1803, Chief Justice Marshall struck down a law of Congress, saying, sorry, it's a nice law, but it's unconstitutional. Okay, so then what we're going to look at now for the next, we're going to take a nice deep dive into 3 or 4 famous cases that explore this question, right? It's one thing to say, okay, well, Congress has these enumerated powers, but no more. But what does that mean in practice? So, Hammer v. Dagenhart, a case from 1918, 11 years before the Depression. It was a child labor law that was intended to protect children. The law banned interstate shipment of goods made by factories employing kids under 14 or using 14 to 16-year-olds for more than 8 hours a day. It's a pretty reasonable law to all of us. And the court actually said, look, we have no problem with the law, maybe a good law, a wise law. But the court struck down the law nevertheless. This was a federal child labor law. This court struck down the law, and it said, quote, the grant of power of Congress over the subject of interstate commerce was to enable it to regulate such interstate commerce, that is, the movement of goods interstate, and not to give it authority to control the states in their own exercise of police power over local issues. The court reasoned that the Commerce Clause was not intended to give Congress a general authority to improve working conditions. The federal government, and this is quoting the court, the federal government was a government of enumerated powers and could not go beyond the boundary drawn by the 10th Amendment. In interpreting the Constitution, it must never be forgotten that the nation is made up of states to which are entrusted the powers of local government. And to them and to the people, the powers not delegated to the national government are reserved. Now, here we first meet one of my favorite Supreme Court justices by the name of Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes dissented in this case, and he said, this is not right. This case involved, clearly this factory makes, these factories that are involving using child labor, they are producing goods that then get shipped in interstate commerce. That's all. He said, that's the end of the story. That's all we need to know. We don't need to question what Congress is doing. As long as they're regulating a factory that ships interstate, that should be the end of the inquiry. And he said, quote, "I had thought that the propriety," this is Holmes's dissent, "I had thought that the propriety of the exercise of the Commerce Clause power was for the consideration of Congress alone, and that this Supreme Court always has disavowed the right to intrude in its judgments upon questions of policy or morals." So that was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's both here and even more famously in the area of free speech. He is an absolute champion and his views ultimately become adopted. Interesting thing about Holmes, he was born in Massachusetts to an aristocratic family, highly educated, but he has a Loudoun County connection. I did not know this until I was reading for this class, a little bit of his history. That many will ring true to many of you who know even a little bit of history of Loudoun County. As a young man, he fought for the Massachusetts 20th Infantry Regiment. I don't know if anybody's a Civil War buff here, but the Massachusetts 20th Infantry Regiment fought, where do they fight? Ball's Bluff. Ball's Bluff. And so Oliver Wendell Holmes, as a young man, fought and felt it was just a terrible disgrace. Some of his friends were injured. He lost. Some were killed. He thought it was a completely worthless battle that served no purpose and ended up killing a lot of young men. And that was one of his early experiences in the Civil War, and it really moved him for a long time. Anyways, we're going to come back and hear more about Oliver Wendell Holmes in later classes. So that was 1918, 10, 11 years before the Depression. Then we move into the Great Depression, and then 1929, the stock market crashed, the Great Depression, eventually Franklin Delano Roosevelt's elected, and as we know, FDR wanted to help bring the nation out of the Depression with the New Deal. He had all kinds of laws that he wanted to get passed that would help the country, help regular workers, help people get out of the Depression. And he had a friendly Congress. Congress was willing to pass these laws, which Martin Luther King helped to bring about, forbid racial discrimination in any restaurant if the restaurant served interstate customers or if a substantial portion of food it served had traveled in interstate commerce. So again, it banned racial discrimination if there was a strong, some kind of a nexus to interstate commerce. So, you think Congress, and the law itself really shows, right? Congress could have said, look, we ban racial discrimination in restaurants, period, right? They could have just said that. But that wouldn't have been good enough under the Constitution. They say, look, we ban racial discrimination in restaurants if that restaurant has a connection to interstate commerce. Because Congress knew they had to tie this law to one of the powers given to them in the Constitution. So they did. They tied the 1964 Civil Rights Law to one of the powers of the Constitution. So Ollie's Barbecue was a restaurant in Birmingham, Alabama. It was about 10 blocks off the interstate. About 46% of Ollie's food that it served came from out of state. So 46% of the food it served moved to interstate commerce. Ollie's restaurant barred blacks from eating inside the restaurant. It had for the last 50 years. And it argued that the government had no power to force it to admit blacks. It said that this was a purely local business and a purely local issue and beyond the reach of the federal government. Congress defended the law under the Commerce Clause and said, under the Commerce Clause, we have the power. So Congress didn't defend it on kind of moral grounds and say this is the morally right thing to do, which of course it was, but they said, as a matter of constitutional law, we, Congress, have the power to pass this law under the Commerce Clause. And they said, and then the court listed some of the findings, a couple quotes from the decision. The court said, the record is replete with testimony of the burdens placed on interstate commerce by racial discrimination in restaurants. And again, this is 1964. A comparison of per capita spending by blacks in restaurants in areas where discrimination is widely practiced shows much less spending by them in those areas. This condition, which has been especially aggravated in the South, was attributed by the Secretary of Commerce to racial segregation. This decreased spending springing from a refusal to serve blacks in restaurants has a close and negative connection to interstate commerce. So with that logic, the court upheld the law under the Commerce Clause, and it ruled that Ollie's Barbecue and every restaurant like Ollie's Barbecue must serve all customers regardless of race. So Ollie's was a victory for the civil rights movement, and it showed an expansive reading of the Commerce Clause. So then we jump forward 30 years to the Lopez case. So again, we're jumping from first we were before the New Deal in Lenhart. Then we went to the New Deal, then 1964. Now we're going to 1995. The Lopez case is another one of the very famous Commerce Clause cases in the Constitution. In all of these cases, in every one of these cases, it's always the same question. Does Congress have the power under the Constitution to pass the law? That's kind of the question in every case. The question is not, is it a good law? Is it a smart law? Is it a wise law? Oftentimes the court will say, when we get to Lopez, they're going to say, yeah, we think it's a good law. We have no problem with the law. But the question is, does Congress have the authority to pass the law? So the Lopez case is a federal law passed by Congress that forbids possession of guns within 1,000 feet of any school. So we're within 1,000 feet of the Hillsboro Elementary School here, probably 1,000 feet I would guess, so could not have any guns under this law, within 1,000 feet. Lopez was a student who brought a gun to school, and he sued to say that he might have sued under the Second Amendment argument, but instead he sued under the Commerce Clause, and he said, sorry, this law, Congress has no power to pass this law. Where in the Constitution is it given Congress the power to ban guns within 1,000 feet of a school? There's nowhere in the Constitution does Congress have that power. So that was Lopez's argument. Congress argued the other way. Congress defended its law and said, all guns are sold in interstate commerce. The guns are produced in one state and shipped to other states to be sold. Criminals move in interstate commerce. Levels of violence affect interstate commerce. Economic health of areas depends on violence, on the control of gun violence. So often insurance is involved in terms of insuring stores or businesses against violence. All of these things, Congress, a long list of ways in which guns and the movement of guns and the sale of guns was very much tied up in interstate commerce. The court, listening to both sides, okay, Lopez arguing Congress has no power, Congress arguing, yeah, we have the power. So the court starts out with two great quotes, and these two great quotes really summarize today's class, and they come from no less authority than James Madison. First, in Federalist paper number 45, Madison says, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Later on, Madison says, just as the separation and independence of the coordinate branches of the federal government serve to prevent the accumulation of excessive power in any one branch, a healthy balance between the state and the federal governments will reduce the risk of tyranny and abuse from either front. So I love these quotes because in that one quote, Madison is talking about both the horizontal branch balance and the vertical balance in one sentence. So Madison is on top of this stuff, no surprise, father of the Constitution. But and so we know that when the court quotes Madison in that way, when they quote Federalist 45, they're very likely to not look favorably on the law because they're talking about how Congress is limited. So the court strikes down the law. They go out of their way to say, look, this may be a good law, maybe a wise law, maybe a very smart law, but this is beyond any power Congress has. It's beyond the Commerce Clause, no other power. The court is very worried about a slippery slope. The court says that if Congress can pass this law, is there any law that they can't pass? And if that happens, if there's any law that Congress can pass, then the constitutional structure is lost, federalism is lost, the vertical balance is lost, and the federal government, rather than being a government of enumerated powers, becomes a government of unlimited powers. And with that, the court says the law falls because Congress lacks the power to pass it. Okay, so then we move forward 5 more years to another famous and controversial case, generated tremendous controversy and tremendous number of law review articles analyzing the case, but it's known as U.S. v. Morrison. It's got very horrible facts. Don't even really want to get deep into the facts, but essentially there was a terrible rape at a university setting by Morrison, or he was accused of being the rapist along with another college male, and they were, first college wouldn't even accept that they, wouldn't listen to the woman, really terrible facts. But eventually, Morrison was prosecuted under a federal law that gave increased criminal penalties for certain crimes if they were motivated by gender. Here's a text of a very brief snippet. I took just a very brief snippet of the law itself. The law says, quote, "A person who commits a crime of violence motivated by gender and thus deprives another of his or her civil rights shall be liable to the party injured in an action for the recovery of compensatory and punitive damages." And essentially, it increased the penalty if it was a gender-motivated crime. So Morrison defended himself by saying, sorry, you can't prosecute me because Congress has no power to pass this law. This law giving heightened penalties for gender-motivated crimes is beyond the power of Congress. The court goes out of its way, really out of its way, to say this is probably a very good law. We need this law. Congress defended the law by noting the importance, noting that there was a huge amount of evidence put into the congressional record before they passed the law. During the debates over the law, they put in a huge amount of evidence showing pervasive gender bias in various state and local criminal justice systems against victims of gender-motivated violence. Congress noted that this was supported by voluminous evidence of experts and pointed to hundreds and hundreds of pages and reports in the congressional record. Again, the court went out of its way to say, we have no argument that this is a good law, a wise law, a needed law, but the question is, in every case here, does the Congress have the power to pass the law? That's the question in every case. Here, the court starts out by citing to Marbury v. Madison, the case we read last week. And in that one, the court, and the quote they had was from Marbury was to say, and this is quoting Chief Justice Marshall, every law, quote, "Every law enacted by Congress must be based on one or more of the powers enumerated in the Constitution. The powers of the legislature are defined and limited, and that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten, the Constitution is written." So I love that line by Chief Justice Marshall, where I just say it again. The powers of the legislature are defined and limited, and that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten, the Constitution is written. So a great quote from Chief Justice Marshall. And with that quote, as you might guess, Congress rules against Congress, rules in favor of Morrison, and says that Congress had no power to pass the law. It rejects the Commerce Clause argument, saying that criminal law is traditionally an area of state law, and there's no clear nexus to interstate commerce. Another quote from the court, it says, if this law can be said to govern interstate commerce, it would obliterate the distinction between what is national and what is local in the activities of commerce. It would obliterate the balance of power between the federal government and the state governments. Interestingly, Congress also defended the law, not only on the Commerce Clause, but they defended the law on the 14th Amendment. Now, we looked at the 14th Amendment last week. The 14th Amendment is one of 3 amendments passed during the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, the 3 amendments called the Civil War Amendments. And most people would say the 14th Amendment is probably, other than the Bill of Rights itself, the 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment in the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment does many, many things. It's a fairly long amendment. But one thing it does is it guarantees equal protection of law. The 14th Amendment also overrules Dred Scott, which we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Dred Scott and all of the slavery cases and all of the race cases in class 5, for class 4. But the most important thing that the 14th Amendment does, what makes it the most famous part of the 14th Amendment, is in Section 1, and I quote, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." So this clause is loaded, right? I mean, just in that short sentence, there have probably been 10,000 cases interpreting what I just read. It's such a huge source of constitutional debate and litigation. But the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause has been the primary vehicle for increasing equality in this country. The primary Equal Protection Clause was the primary vehicle that was used by Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement to achieve equal protection along with the Commerce Clause. So a tremendously important clause. And so, and one other, before we get to bring the 14th Amendment back to the Morrison case, one other really important thing about the 14th Amendment, if you're paying close attention, one of the things I read that it says, no state shall make or enforce any law, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Where have you heard that before? Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. Does that sound familiar? It's very close to the Declaration of Independence, but it's also already in the Constitution, right? In the Fifth Amendment. So if you look at the Fifth Amendment, so you look at towards the end of the Fifth Amendment, nor shall any person be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So what is going on there? Did the drafters of the 14th Amendment just kind of forget, like, oops, gosh, we didn't notice it was the 5th, we put in the 14th, and after we put out that 14th, like, oops, what happened? Why did they does anybody know why they repeated themselves in the 14th Amendment?
I think it strengthens the Constitution because it says the principles apply to both.
To both what?
Both of the amendments. Like, why create a new standard if you can use an existing one?
Right. So the difference, it's subtle. How does the First Amendment? How does the First Amendment start? What is the first word in the First Amendment? Congress. The very first word in the First Amendment is Congress, right? So Congress, the federal Congress, taking this now to the Fifth Amendment, federal Congress shall pass no law depriving a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That is the famous Due Process Clause. But the Fifth Amendment is aimed at Congress. The 14th Amendment, what had just happened? What had happened in our country? The Civil War. And who did we no longer trust? We no longer trusted the states, especially the former slave states. So the 14th Amendment, what does the 14th Amendment say? No state shall deny life, liberty, or property with due process. So the Civil War amendments were all about the reality of the Civil War, the reality of slavery, the reality of Jim Crow, and that before we had seen Congress be the greatest threat to liberty, after the Civil War, we correctly saw the states as the greatest threat to liberty. So that was why we have the clause twice, to drive home that this clause applies to the states. Now, when they wrote this right after the Civil War, they did not, the drafters of the 14th Amendment did not know that the Bill of Rights would eventually be, quote unquote, incorporated to the states. So eventually the Supreme Court has through various cases, has ruled that nearly all, not all, but nearly all of the Bill of Rights in the first 8 amendments apply equally to the states. So if they had done that, then you wouldn't really have needed the 14th Amendment. But at the time they passed the 14th Amendment, that had not happened. The incorporation happened in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Actually, it's still happening even today. Occasionally they do a new incorporation. Okay, so right before the break, last 2 minutes, bringing this back to Morrison, the Morrison case, the Congress said, okay, fine, we don't have power under the Commerce Clause, we have power under the 14th Amendment to pass this law. And they said, look, this woman is being deprived of equal protection of the laws. And here's all the evidence, all these laws and these justice systems all through the country are treating women unfairly, especially in sexual crimes. And look at the 14th Amendment. What does the Section 5 of the 14th Amendment say? Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Congress shall have the power. And Congress said, look, here, we have the power. We got it right, it says it right there, we have the power. End of the case, we win. And the court said, sorry, you lose. Sorry, you lose on the 14th Amendment. Why do you lose? Because of the state action doctrine. This is an incredibly important part of the 14th Amendment, and it's also part of the First Amendment. No state shall deny you of equal protection of the law. So if a state set up a system where, literally the state passed a law discriminating based on gender, that may have been enough. Now, of course, we didn't get gender equality. Maybe we don't even now, but it took Ruth Bader Ginsburg and very recent years to get some more recent gender equality. But a facially gender discriminatory law would have at least given an argument that this violates the 14th Amendment. Here, Morrison said, look, this is my private conduct. And so this is this key distinction between state action and private action. So if I were to have a party tomorrow night and invite people, but I was going to say, and of course it would be morally reprehensible to say this, but I was going to say, I'm going to have a party, but no Irish can come to my party. I hate the Irish. No Irish. And so that, if a state, if Rogers, the mayor of Hillsboro, said the school is going to, the Old Stone School is wide open for anybody except no Irish can come here, that would violate the 14th Amendment because he's the state. He's the big bad state. Whereas I'm just a private citizen. And the 14th Amendment does not reach the conduct of private citizens, nor does the First Amendment. That's a fundamental point of constitutional law. It does not reach, so you can be as racist as you want to be or as sexist as you want to be in your personal life, and you're beyond the reach of the law. You may not have very many friends, and you may be a bad person, but the Constitution does not reach that. So Morrison, won the case. The court struck down the law. And that's so why don't we take a break now, and then we'll come back and pick up with the Obamacare case. Known as the Sebelius case, where Obamacare was passed, and one of the features of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was that it had a mandate that said if you didn't buy insurance under certain circumstances, you could get penalized. There'd be a financial penalty. And that was challenged by a number of states, and one of their arguments was Congress had no power to pass this. They had no power to pass this requirement to buy insurance and then impose this financial penalty if you didn't. The court, in a long decision, agreed that Congress lacked power under the Commerce Clause. The Congress had defended their right. They said, look, health care, of course it involves interstate commerce. It's all over the place. It's a huge, massive business, interstate commerce all over the place. The court, in a long decision, rejected that and said, there is no, this is beyond the power of, healthcare simply is a local issue. It's traditionally governed by the states, not part of the Commerce Clause. However, Justice Roberts, in a 5-4 vote, still upheld the law, still upheld the Affordable Care Act, but under the government's power to tax. He said this mandate and this penalty looks an awful lot like a tax. He said you could read it as saying, you have a choice. If you decide not to buy, then you pay this tax, and Congress has power to tax. So because of that tax feature, they upheld the Affordable Care Act, but they found that under the Commerce Clause, the act would have been invalid. Okay, so now those are a bunch of Commerce Clause cases. So you can see sometimes the court reads the Commerce Clause narrowly, sometimes it reads it broadly, and the same is true for all of the other powers under under Article 1 and under the amendments. Now we're going to pivot to what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause, and it's really the mirror image of the Commerce Clause. So the Commerce Clause, the question for every case there is, does Congress have the power to pass this law? But the question is, when the Congress is silent, when Congress has yet to act, when Congress has not yet regulated in a particular area, then what happens? In that case, are the states free to pass laws? Can they pass laws regulating commerce if Congress fails to act? And the answer is yes and no. It depends on the case. The courts have gone both ways. Remember, states have plenary power to act. I mean, as long as the state law doesn't violate, the Constitution or violate a federal law, then the states have the power to act to improve the lives of their people. They don't need to. Unlike the federal government, they don't need to point to a source of power. But in the area of interstate commerce, the court has developed this doctrine called the Dormant Commerce Clause. And as you'll see, it's a very important doctrine. It's important for a particular reason. Why is it important? For the economic health of this country. And in fact, a lot of people say the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine has been one of the reasons why we're such a wealthy, successful country. So let's dig into it a little bit. So one of the most famous cases in the Dormant Commerce Clause area is Dean Milk from 1951. Madison, Wisconsin banned the sale of milk in Madison if it was not pasteurized within 5 miles of Madison. Now, those of you who know Madison and know Wisconsin, there's a lot of dairy, especially back in 1951, a lot of dairy farms, a lot of pride in their local cheese, their local product. If you're a Green Bay Packers fan, you know about cheeseheads. So they're very proud of their dairy heritage. And they felt that they had the best milk, and they wanted to make sure that only this good milk was sold in Madison. But since Madison is more than 5 miles from any state border, that means that no out-of-state milk could be sold in Madison. This was a ban on out-of-state milk. So the law discriminates in favor of Madison dairies and it discriminates against out-of-state milk producers. In other words, the law was blatant protectionism. The court strikes down the law, and the court says to permit Madison to adopt this protectionist milk law and place a discriminatory burden on interstate commerce would invite a multiplication of preferential trade areas in other states and would be destructive of the very purpose of the Commerce Clause. And the court goes on to say, the principle that our economic unit is the nation, which alone has the gamut of powers necessary to regulate interstate commerce. That is the message from the Constitution. The ultimate principle of the Constitution is that one state, in dealing with another, may not place itself in a position of economic isolation, may not erect tariffs. The court reasoned that if we allowed this type of state law, it would destroy the single market within the United States. And that single free market with free movement of goods across the states, across now the 50 states, has long been one of the key ingredients for the economic success and well-being of the United States. So that's one Dormant Commerce Clause case. There are dozens and dozens of them. Another very famous case is the Washington apple case. The state of Washington, as some of you know, has really great apples. They're very famous for their apples. And they have, Washington State had at least back in the 90s, when this case came out in the 1990s, they had a grading system that was the best in the nation. In other words, to get the A grade in Washington State, you had to be a really good apple. And an A grade in Washington State might be, or it would be in Virginia, Virginia may not even have an apple that high a grade. Or an A grade Virginia apple might be a C grade in Washington State. So they had this really intense grading system. To get an A grade, you had to be a perfect apple, and you had to be from Washington. So they had this grading system, and they labeled their apples according to this Washington State grading system that many states, especially in the West, adopted. North Carolina passed a law saying that the only grading system that could be used was the federal grading system standard. The USDA had a voluntary system for grading apples. It wasn't required, but it was voluntary. And North Carolina made it mandatory. They said, we're going to mandate that you can use this USDA federal grading system, but you cannot mention any other grade. And of course, the court said, wait a second here, what's really going on here? What's really going on is before the law was passed, like 65 or 70% of apples sold in North Carolina came from Washington State. And then people were used to them, they liked the grading system. And then when the law was passed, all of a sudden the Washington growers lost their competitive advantage. They lost their marketing advantage, and their market share dropped. The court said there was no purpose. North Carolina tried to defend it by saying, oh, it's kind of confused consumers if we allow these different grades. But Washington State was able to put on experts showing that this has been around for 30 years, no one's been confused. They actually really like this grading system, the Washington grading system. And so they struck down the law. They said the real purpose of the North Carolina law was to gain protection for inferior North Carolina growers against the superior Washington growers. So that's just another example. Again, what drives the Dormant Commerce Clause is this intense desire to not have tariffs between the states, to not have protectionism between the states, to not have discrimination. You can go into any state and sell your product, you can go to any state, sell your service, and that has been, most economists believe, that's been a huge source of success for the United States. This huge free trading zone with almost no restrictions from state to state. So with that's the Dormant Commerce Clause. It's kind of the flip side of the Commerce Clause. There are dozens and dozens of these cases. States can't resist trying to kind of give some local benefit, but the courts watch very carefully. So to end the class today, we want to zoom back out, and we focused on a bunch of specific cases today. But what is the big picture that we take from these cases, from the Commerce Clause cases, from the 14th Amendment, the Dormant Commerce Clause? So remember that the founders, when they drafted the Constitution in the summer of 1787, they were being pulled in two opposite directions, right? They had the lessons of the Revolution. The lessons of the Revolution were very much, we want a small central government, we don't want to repeat the tyranny of the English government, which was abusing us in all the ways listed in the Declaration of Independence. Instead, we want local government in the local towns, the local states, and we give as little power as possible to the federal government, just the minimal necessary, and that was the one pushing them towards small central government. The other, pushing in exactly the opposite direction, was the Articles of Confederation. Remember, our first Constitution, which really only lasted for 4 years. It failed because it created a central government that was too weak, just did not have enough power, did not have enough power to meet the needs of this big, growing new country. And so they were pulled in both directions, right? They tried in the Articles of Confederation, they tried the option of creating a weak federal government. That didn't work. During the period of the Articles of Confederation, in fact, states were free to set up trade barriers and tariffs. So Delaware said, look, if you're from New Jersey and you want to sell New Jersey goods in our state, 20% tariff, 30% tariff. We're gonna. If you're from Delaware, you can sell Delaware goods, but if you're from New Jersey, 30% tariff. And it's what President Trump is talking about. With tariffs for other countries, that was happening in and among the states. They were setting up tariffs against each other. They were trying to protect their own home turf, and the economy was floundering because goods could not move freely from one state to another. So people take it for granted, but this incredible free market we have between the 50 states with almost no hindrance in selling your goods or selling your services between the states is a tremendous advantage. And so the courts watch this very carefully. And if they see a state or a town, oftentimes it's a town, that passes a law that has the effect of discriminating against interstate commerce, they'll strike it down. So those were the two forces. And how did Congress? So we had the experience of the Articles of Confederation. They really only lasted for a few years. 1787, they had to kind of balance these two opposing forces, and especially with Congress. On the one hand, they created a Congress with a whole bunch of important rights: right to declare war, the right to tax, the right to regulate commerce, the necessary and proper clause. All these rights were tremendously important and gave huge power to Congress. But on the other hand, going in the opposite direction, they erected a dozen checks and balances on Congress to make sure that it would be at every step, if Congress tried to exceed its power, it would be checked and it would be stopped. So that's the end of the class for today, and we're happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yes?
When the court interprets the Commerce Clause in that broader sense, and then they narrow their view, do they go back and nullify those cases that were interpreted in the other?
So that's a great question. I mean, so most of the time, so the question was, when Congress passes has a new ruling that seems to go against an old ruling, does the new ruling overrule or get rid of the old ruling? Most of the time, the answer is no, because most of the time they think there's some play in the joints, some wiggle room. You could maybe interpret both cases. Sometimes, most famously, very recently in Roe v. Wade and Dobbs, they will expressly overrule a case, and they'll say that, if you read Dobbs, they literally say Roe v. Wade was incorrect and wrong, and we are overruling it. Another famous example is the Korematsu case, which we're going to read in Class 5, and that's where the Japanese internment case, where people of Japanese ancestry, even though they were American citizens, were sent to internment camps during World War II, and the court has since declared that case incorrect. So sometimes the court will declare a prior case to be incorrect, but most of the time they will not. Yeah, go ahead.
How does Homeland Security fit into the ability of Congress to create new departments, or is that executive?
So that's a great question.
Repeat that question.
So yeah, the question of Homeland Security, how does that department fit into the constitutional structure, right? We have the executive, the legislature, and the judicial. We have the three branches. But it's not just Homeland Security, right? It's like, you name it, the Federal Trade Commission and the CIA and the FBI and the NASA and the Aviation Administration. There are hundreds and hundreds of alphabet soup federal government agencies. And a lot of people have called these the fourth branch of government. We're going to talk about them next week in particular. The answer is that Congress can set them up, but once they're set up, it's really the president that carries out the laws. He executes the laws. And so if they have a job like NASA, or the NASA's job is to carry, there's various laws passed by Congress involving space, and NASA carries those out. But it's the president's job, not Congress's job, to execute the laws. There are agencies like the FTC, the Fair Trade Commission, that are called independent agencies. And the courts really have a tough time with those. They are created by Congress, right? FTC was created by Congress. It could be terminated by Congress. But once they create the FTC, the president has a role. He may be able to appoint the FTC commissioners. He may be able to remove them. So there's questions about how much control the president has, and this is almost an agency by agency question. This is an area of actually a very hot area of debate in the constitutional scholars, because if you've heard of what's called the unitary executive theory, that theory argues that all the agencies should be 100% under the control of the president, that there should be no independent agencies. But so it depends agency by agency, but generally Congress will set them up, and then the president will make sure that the law, that those agencies, those departments, they're involved in carrying out laws that Congress has passed. Yeah.
The Congress can control that by funding that, right?
Yes.
So if I don't, hey, you're going off the reservation, I'm going to...
Congress has the power of the purse, absolutely, not the president, right? So Congress has the power. Now the president can try to shift around some money from here to there, but generally Congress has the power of the purse, and they can absolutely defund an agency, absolutely, or they can lower, and that happens all the time. We've seen many agencies that had their budget lowered or decreased. So yes, so the power of the purse is with Congress, and that is a very powerful power. Yes.
Post-Civil War, I'm assuming the southern states had the right to vote on the 14th Amendment. And what was the final vote on the 14th?
So the answer was that the vote, remember to ratify, to get an amendment, this is the fifth, the amendment process is laid out in Article 5, and we know that you need 2/3 either of Congress or of a convention of states to propose a constitutional amendment, and then you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. The short answer is that after the Civil War, the way in which the Civil War amendments were ratified, the people who voted for the southern states were not necessarily the people from those states. There was a lot of funny business going on to get those amendments ratified. But, the war just ended. There was not a lot of sympathy for respecting the rights but essentially a lot of funny business went on, putting in place, okay, Alabama, you're going to vote on the 14th, and by the way, here's these guys from New York who, now they're Alabamans, and they're going to vote for you. So step aside, that some of that went on. So, yes, next, any other questions? Yeah.
If Congress is empowered to regulate commerce with foreign nations, how is it that the executive can set a tariff on foreign nations?
So that's another great question. So the question was, the foreign affairs, and we're going to talk about this a lot next class. So, like many, many powers, the foreign affairs power is shared between and not by accident, intentionally, the foreign affairs power is shared between Congress. The Commerce Clause, you correctly say, the Congress gets to regulate commerce among the foreign nations. Of course, there's another role that Congress has, right? So when the president negotiates a treaty with a foreign nation, it's not valid unless ratified by the Senate. So there's this very intentional sharing of power. We see that throughout the Constitution. But the classic is the war power, right? The Congress has the power to declare war, but President is commander-in-chief. So, and we're going to talk about war power next week, because even though Congress has the power to declare war, the actual pattern and practice in this country over the last 50 years since the Korean War, so the last, 80, 70 years, is that the president has taken most of the war power, and Congress has simply failed to act. And there are a lot of people in Congress that are aware of this. A lot of people in Congress are aware that they need to reassert their war power or their foreign affairs power. But the president, because he's a single person, can move more quickly, right? Congress can't get their act together. They can't decide on anything. But there are many in Congress who raise the question you just raised and say, look, we've got a foreign affairs power too. We should be out there telling the president what to do in terms of treaties. He gets to negotiate them, we get to ratify them, or on the war power. So these are areas where the founders intentionally shared the power between the president and Congress, but Congress has been asleep at the switch for many years, and President said, you guys are sleeping, I'll take the power, and I'll do everything.
But timeliness is essence.
Yes.
At certain times, right? If there's a conflict, go in and say, hey, we're going to get Congress together, hey, what do you guys think?
Right.
Missiles are coming in. They got to
well, no, right, and so that's right. No, it's long been agreed that the president, if there's a crisis or an attack or something where you need to act quickly, it's been accepted that the president has power to repel an invasion or to act in a defensive way,
So we have,
even without Congress declaring war.
so within the NATO treaty, right, if there's an attack, then we by treaty would respond to that, right? Because we have a treaty that's been approved by.
Yeah, right.
Now, however, if we turn that around and put the position with Taiwan, there's no treaty, nothing says we have to, we can jump on.
Yeah.
It require Congress to declare war.
Yeah, no, you should, absolutely.
Taiwan's not going to be like NATO.
Right, and hopefully we won't, yeah. But it's, so these are hard questions, there's no easy answer. I mean, Congress has the power to declare war, that much is clear. President's commander-in-chief, that much is clear. But if we're going to send forces to Taiwan, Congress should decide that. Unless there's some, President can act by himself. If we're being attacked, everybody agrees, President does not need to wait for congressional authority if the enemy is on our shores. Go ahead.
So in the Middle East right now, we've got ships, we've got people, military people already stationed in that area. There's been no declaration of war by the United States.
Right. There have only been, Congress has only declared war, I believe, 4 times. But what Congress often will do is they will authorize the use of military force. So they don't want to necessarily declare war, but after 9/11, Congress passed a law signed by President, so it was a valid law authorizing the use of military force. It's called, and the authors the AUMF, and that law is still in place. It happened after 9/11, and so the president will often tie his actions to that law. Most of the war on terror the president has pointed to that law. Now Congress could remove that law any day. They could say that law. They could just pass a new law saying this law is no longer valid. But again, I mean, it's up to Congress to. We're going to talk about this next week, but in the area of war powers, Congress has lots of power under the Constitution, but they often fail to use them. And I think Napoleon was the one who said that power is available for he who uses it, right? And so Congress has the power, but they don't use it. The president uses it, and so he has accrued a lot more war power through just practice. But Congress could tomorrow reassert itself, and there are many congressmen who are well aware of this and who are very focused on reasserting congressional power. But it hasn't happened yet. Yeah.
Yeah, so Article 1, Section 8, okay, I'm not trying to be a dead horse, but that's a different way. Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to provide for calling forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrection, and repel invasions. Have the courts ever weighed in on that? You mentioned practice.
Oh yeah, they have. Yes, they have a few times. We're going to look at those next week. One of the early cases was the prize cases during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln, without congressional authority, set up blockades of southern ports, New Orleans in particular, and and the court found that was lawful because it was using this kind of power to repel, to deal with a sudden crisis. But the court has generally stayed out of this because there's something called the political question doctrine that where a question is highly political, the court will generally try to stay out of it if they can and let the 2 other branches resolve it. And the court recognizes that both President and Congress have a big role to play in war power. Anyways, we're going to talk more about war power next week, but it is an area that's fraught with with difficulty. Yeah.
Regarding the judicial. Does the Constitution have a strict structure of how a court case would climb up through the ranks, finally go through a state court, state judicial, and ultimately to the U.S. judicial court? Is there a structure of how that rises, and what is it?
Yeah, so I mean, Article 3, he's asking about the court structure, which is the judiciary, Article 3. So Article 3 has rules, and it talks about the powers of the federal court. When can you get into federal court? So remember, quick overview, we have a state court system and we have a federal court system. And so in order to get into federal court, you have to have a federal question or constitutional question, right? So a federal question involves a federal law, a federal treaty, or the Constitution. Or there's called diversity jurisdiction, where you have a battle between citizens of different states. So you have to have one of those 2 grounds to get into federal court. If you don't have one of those 2 grounds, then you're stuck in state court, and you can never go to the Supreme Court. So that's kind of the first basic rule. And then once if you're in federal court, then trial court, intermediate appellate court, and then you can go to the Supreme Court. But most cases never make it to the Supreme Court. Most people never even try to go to the Supreme Court. We've tried. We've a lot of clients we make a try to go, but the court rejects the case. Most of the time, they'll reject cases because they don't think it's important enough. So most people never have a right, never make it to the Supreme Court. But the first test is, do you even get into federal court? You either need to have a federal question or what's called diversity jurisdiction.
Once you pass that test, how many layers are there before you? 2.
There's the trial court, which is the district court, federal district court, and then the court of appeal. So here we're in Virginia has Virginia district courts, and we have the Fourth Circuit. You go to the Fourth Circuit, and then if you lose the Fourth Circuit, you can try to go to the Supreme Court. You're entitled to ask the Supreme Court to look at your case, but 9 times out of 10 they'll refuse to hear it.
Unless a judge pushes it up.
Right. There are some exceptions. Right. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, I see this pamphlet on my table, and I have a question. As we all are, some of us at least, are curious about how companies out of this state are driving electricity demands within the state and causing land use issues. Is there a Commerce Clause argument anywhere in there that local people could use to sort of require these out-of-state companies to pay more of the costs that are being brought to bear here?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. The data centers and the uses of electricity. I mean, first, there's always the Commerce Clause question and then the Dormant Commerce Clause question. So the Commerce Clause question, it seems pretty clear that the federal government has the right. This is like almost a classic interstate commerce, the flow of electricity, around the world, around the country. So that would seem to easily fall within the power of Congress. If Virginia were to, or Loudoun County were to pass some kind of law restricting, data centers in some way, that might violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. I mean, depending if it was a law that was non-discriminatory that said, no data centers, we don't care where you're from, just period, no data centers. But of course, if they favored, local companies, right, not going to happen. But certainly that's right. But it's so I think a state could, if they wanted to, of course, politically that wouldn't happen, but if they wanted to, they could regulate data centers as long as they did it in a non-discriminatory way. If there was any sense that they were favoring some local business or locals over out of state, then it would violate the Dormant Commerce Clause.
Is there any possibility of uplifting all of the arguments to the federal level?
Perhaps. I have to think about that some more. That's a good question. That's a hard one. Yeah.
There are a lot of political leaders, including members of Congress and executive branch members, who are saying democracy doesn't work, and we really don't need to have democracy anymore, and we're opposed to democracy. And yet there's an oath of office that every member of Congress takes, and the president takes, and I believe military members take a specified pledge to defend the Constitution. Is that just lip service? Because it ain't happening. Very few people could vote. Basically, white males who own property, right? A very small percentage. Now, we have almost universal suffrage. We fought the hard, long fights to get voting for African Americans, former slaves. We fought the long, hard fight to get voting for women. We got rid of the poll tax. We had the Civil Rights Act. I mean, the arc of the Constitution over 200 years has been to increase democracy without any question. So I'm a big believer in it. I think there's more right, I think, with the Constitution and with the country than there is wrong. But I'm the first to admit there are 100 problems that we could talk about that make it far from perfect. So, yeah.
How do we legally get money out of the process?
Yeah, that's it.
In terms of lobbyists, because that negates, the will of the people.
Right, and that's the Citizens United case, and that is, there are a number of cases that are very controversial that I tend to agree with a lot of Supreme Court cases. That's one I disagree with. Another one I disagree with is the presidential immunity case. We're going to talk about that next week. But, that case and a few other cases like it have said that corporations have a First Amendment speech right to spend money on corporations. I think that's wrong. A lot of people think that's wrong. But that's our current, so until that case is overturned, that case needs to, unless you can overturn that case, nothing Congress can do about it, because that's a constitutional case where the court has the final say on that kind of issue. Yeah.
It seems like that the founding documents or whatever make the Supreme Court look non-political. That they're just going by the laws and whatnot, but yet more and more it seems like they are political. I mean, one of the things in every presidential election now is you vote for Trump, you're going to get Trump Supreme Court nominee. Mm-hmm. You vote for Harris, you're going to get liberal-leaning justices. So it seems like that that's I don't know if it's an ideal or not. It's just not possible, or hadn't worked out that way.
Yeah, no, it's a very fair criticism for sure. Oh, sorry. So the question about how justices of the Supreme Court are appointed by presidents and they become political, or they're seen as being, you may recall a few years ago, President Trump was talking about Trump judges and Biden judges or Obama judges, and Chief Justice Roberts rebuked him and said, no, we're not justices for one president. We're just all, doing our level best to kind of apply the law as we see it. And we're going to talk about this next week. So it's certainly a fair criticism. I will not disagree with you. And think about the FDR and the New Deal, right? He wanted to appoint people who he wanted to appoint justices that he thought would agree with him. So he was kind of committing the same sin. But it's not very hard, and I can talk about this next week, it's not very hard to find hundreds of examples, where the justices have ruled against the president that appointed them. A very recent case was the Trump v. Vance case, where, if you may recall, in 2020, President Trump Cyrus Vance, a New York prosecutor, was subpoenaed Trump's financial records to pursue a criminal investigation, and Trump refused. He said, "You're not going to get my records. I'm not going to turn them over. I'm the president. They're immune. I have presidential immunity." That was a 7-2 ruling against Trump, and Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch both voted against Trump. So, there are hundreds and hundreds or thousands of examples where justices appointed by the president ruled against that president. When President Trump was contesting the 2020 election, there were 62 cases filed by President Trump, or 62 rulings by appellate courts, state courts, trial courts. Trump lost 61. He actually ultimately lost 62 of them, because even the one he won and got overturned, he lost it on appeal. But in that group of cases, there were like 14 judges appointed by President Trump that ruled against him. So, you have these counter examples, but you're absolutely right. There's no doubt there's a certain amount of politics that you cannot escape from. So, yes, go ahead.
So I'm trying to understand the difference of powers between states and federal government. And I understand when the founding fathers created the Constitution, there was some states locally supposed to be for the states and things more general for federal government. What about the environment? Like the air is moving, the water is moving through states. Right? Who is in charge of regulating that and protecting?
It's a great question. So who is regulating the environment? I mean, that's very much a shared area. So every state, Virginia has the state. If you've ever dealt with the Virginia EPA, Virginia has a very active state EPA. But the federal government, one of the cases I mentioned literally just today, the Supreme Court in the last 6 hours ago, and you cannot get any more reason than that, 6 hours ago the Supreme Court denied a challenge by conservative states against President Biden's and his agency's actions to limit the emissions of methane and mercury from power plants. So that is a federal government, so obviously the US EPA is highly involved in regulating the environment. So it's a very much shared, so many areas. In fact, most areas of the law are shared between the federal government and the states. There's a few, such as immigration and nuclear regulation, that are exclusively federal. But most areas are shared by the states and the federal government. Yeah, back there.
Could you just explain for the group how executive orders play into all of this?
I'll briefly mention it. That's going to be a topic for next week, so I don't want to get, but executive orders are kind of a funny misnomer, because the punchline is that they really mean nothing. I mean, the president has, he only has the powers given to him in the Constitution, and we're going to talk about that. But one of his most important power is to execute the laws. He's called the executive branch. He executes the laws. And he can execute the laws in any number. There's no magic way to do it. He could have the Department of Education execute them, or he could issue an executive order telling the Department of Education. Let's say, like, Congress has passed some law saying, okay, we're going to have this new, federal standards for handicap access in schools. Handicap access in schools is a federal standard, and pass the law, and the Department of Education implements the new federal standard for handicap education, or he can just issue an executive order and get all the press and look all fancy. But it's the same thing. There's nothing. Executive order is almost a meaningless phrase. There's no additional power that the president has when he issues an executive order. Yep. So we say like 2 more questions. Okay, this and one more. Go ahead.
Separation of church and state. We have to pay you for another 6 weeks?
I'm not being paid. This is all volunteer.
Or is that in the week's?
That, we are not planning to cover it, but if you want, I can, on the last class we're talking about the First Amendment and separation of church and state, which is incredibly important, is part of the First Amendment, so we can mention it in that last class.
The reason I'm asking is I just heard on the radio, and this is the state versus the federal. Oklahoma is mandating Bibles in schools.
Trump us.
I'm not, I just heard that on the radio.
Yeah.
Right, so, another 6 weeks is fine.
Yeah. No, I mean, and the court's all over that kind of thing. The court is heavily involved in these issues. So, but remember, just very briefly on religion, the First Amendment governs religion, but so important that the First Amendment has 2 religion clauses. People sometimes forget that, but it has 2 religion clauses, right? Congress can pass no law respecting the establishment of religion, so there can be no state church like there was before the Revolution, right? Before the Revolution, you had to go to church and you got penalized if you didn't, or maybe thrown in jail. The second clause, nor shall Congress pass no law interfering with the free exercise of religion, so that both are there. I think she had her hand up first. Sorry.
Are we going to have any time to talk about Jack Smith's?
Next week. Next week is all about presidential power, and we're going to talk about the immunity ruling. And the punchline with Jack Smith's new brief is that it just feeds right from the immunity ruling, right? He's just trying to describe the actions of President Trump in a way that gets around the immunity ruling. So, okay, I think that's one more. One last question. Go ahead.
You said class 5 is going to be on the 3rd?
Yes, so it's next week is Thursday, then Friday, and then back to Thursday, and then Friday. I know, that's what I'm saying. This is a change. Roger sent around an email announcing the change, yeah. But yes, so class 5 is on a Thursday, not Friday. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.